4.5 miles above the Pacific Ocean, Lieutenant Richard Halsey Best looked down through the optical sight of his Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber. His gloved hand rested on the bomb release lever. 1,000 pounds of high explosive hung beneath his aircraft waiting. Below him, through breaks in the scattered clouds, he could see the Japanese aircraft carrier Akagi, the Red Dragon, the ship that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. Best was 32 years old, a farm boy from Bayonne, New Jersey, son of a factory worker who had immigrated from England. He loved baseball. He had married his high school sweetheart, Doris. They had a daughter waiting for him back home. He was not a man who sought glory. He was not a man who bragged. He was simply a naval aviator doing his job on a Thursday morning in the middle of the world's largest ocean. In 8 seconds, he would release that bomb. In 8 seconds, he would change the course of World War II. In 8 seconds, one ordinary American would prove that courage and duty matter more than overwhelming force. This is that story. The warm sun broke through the cockpit canopy as Best adjusted his dive angle. 70 degrees, almost vertical. His airspeed indicator climbed past 240 miles per hour, 250, 260. The carrier's flight deck grew larger in his bomb sight with each passing heartbeat. He could see individual aircraft parked on the deck. He could see fuel lines snaking across the wooden planking. He could see men in white uniforms running between the planes, desperate to rearm them with torpedoes for a counterattack against the American carriers. Those men had no idea what was about to happen. Best had flown from the USS Enterprise that morning with one mission: find the Japanese carrier strike force, destroy it, go home. Simple orders. The kind of orders that get men killed. The kind of orders that win wars. His bomb would strike the carrier near the center elevator in exactly 5 seconds. It would punch through 2 inches of steel flight deck plating. It would penetrate to the hangar deck below. It would detonate in the exact spot where aircraft were being refueled. The resulting explosion would ignite thousands of gallons of aviation gasoline. The fire would trigger a chain reaction of secondary explosions from armed torpedoes and bombs stacked on the hangar deck. Within 90 seconds, the entire midsection of the Akagi would transform into a blast furnace, reaching temperatures over 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. But Best did not know any of that yet. All he knew was that his bomb sight was perfectly aligned. His dive angle was correct. His airspeed was optimal. At 1,800 feet above the Pacific, his hand moved the release lever. The bomb fell free. 6 months earlier, America had been on its knees. December 7th, 1941. A Sunday morning. Families across America were getting ready for church. Men were reading the newspaper over coffee. Children were playing in yards decorated for Christmas. The world was at peace. At least the American world was at peace. Then the radio broadcast began. Pearl Harbor lay in ruins. Japanese carrier aircraft had struck without warning. 2,403 Americans were dead. 8 battleships had been destroyed or damaged. The Arizona had exploded, taking 1,177 men with her. The Oklahoma had capsized. The California was sinking. The Pacific Fleet, the shield that protected America's western coast, had been shattered in less than 2 hours. President Roosevelt called it a date which would live in infamy. He was right. But December 7th was only the beginning. In the months that followed, the Japanese military machine rolled across the Pacific like an unstoppable tsunami. Wake Island fell. Guam fell. The Philippines fell. General MacArthur retreated to Australia, promising to return, but not knowing if that promise could ever be kept. Singapore, the great British fortress that was supposed to be impregnable, surrendered to a Japanese force half its size. Hong Kong fell. The Dutch East Indies fell. Burma fell. Japanese forces pushed to the very doorstep of India and Australia. Everywhere the rising sun advanced, Allied forces retreated or surrendered. The Japanese carrier strike forced the Kido Butai led this conquest. 4 heavy aircraft carriers formed its core: Akagi, Kaiga, Soryu, Haryu. These were the ships that had devastated Pearl Harbor. These were the ships that had struck targets from Hawaii to Ceylon. They had never lost a battle. They had never even been seriously damaged. Japanese naval officers spoke of them with the kind of reverence that soldiers reserve for invincible weapons. The Akagi, the flagship, carried 66 aircraft. Her name meant Red Castle in Japanese, but Western intelligence officers called her the Red Dragon. She was 260 meters long. She could make 31 knots at full speed. She had been built as a battle cruiser, but converted to a carrier in the 1920s. Her flight deck stretched like a wooden runway in the sky, launching plane after plane into battle. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the Kido Butai from Akagi's bridge. He was the man who had ordered the attack on Pearl Harbor. He was the man who had brought the Imperial Japanese Navy to the peak of its power. And in June 1942, he believed his force was invincible. He had every reason to believe it. But Admiral Nagumo had made a critical miscalculation, one that would cost him everything. America had broken the Japanese naval code. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, knew exactly when the Japanese would attack Midway Island. He knew which forces they would commit. He knew their planned route. And he had positioned 3 American aircraft carriers in ambush, hidden beyond the range of Japanese reconnaissance aircraft, but perfectly placed to strike when the moment was right. Enterprise, Hornet, Yorktown, 3 carriers against 4. 3 carriers against the most powerful carrier strike force ever assembled. On paper, the odds favored Japan. But wars are not won on paper. They are won by men who refuse to quit. Men who understand that doing your duty matters more than calculating the odds. Men like Dick Best. Richard Halsey Best had not planned to become a hero. He had grown up in Bayonne, New Jersey, in the shadow of the oil refineries and shipping docks. His father worked in a factory. His mother raised 3 children on a tight budget during the Depression. Young Dick played baseball in the streets and dreamed of becoming a professional ball player. But he was good at math and science, and when the opportunity came to attend the United States Naval Academy, he took it. He graduated in 1932, right in the middle of his class. Nothing spectacular, no awards for academic excellence, no notable achievements. His fitness reports described him as steady, reliable, competent, the kind of words that damn a man with faint praise. But Dick Best did not care about glory. He cared about doing his job correctly. He became a dive bomber pilot because the Navy needed dive bomber pilots. It was the most dangerous job in naval aviation. Dive bombers attacked by plunging almost straight down toward their targets, releasing their bombs at terrifyingly low altitudes, then pulling out of the gate while enemy anti-aircraft fire tried to tear them apart. Combat survival rates for dive bomber crews hovered around 50%. Many pilots washed out of the training program. Dick Best completed it without a single failed flight. He married Doris Avis Albro in 1934. She was his high school sweetheart. They had 1 daughter, Barbara Ann. Best sent half his pay home to Doris every month. He wrote her letters every week when he was at sea, describing the weather, asking about Barbara's schoolwork, never mentioning the danger. Doris kept every letter in a box tied with string. Years later, when historians asked to read them, she would say that they were private, that they were just a man talking to his wife, nothing heroic about them. But that was the point. Dick Best was not trying to be a hero. He was trying to be a good husband, a good father, and a good naval officer. In that order. He believed that if you did your job correctly every single time, if you never cut corners, if you never gave up, then the results would take care of themselves. On the morning of June 4th, 1942, that philosophy was about to be tested in the most dramatic way possible. Best woke up at 4:30. The USS Enterprise was steaming northwest of Midway Island, preparing to launch aircraft. The ship's mess served scrambled eggs, toast, and coffee. Best ate quickly. His hands were steady. Some pilots threw up before combat missions. Some paced the ready room, unable to sit still. Best sat calmly reviewing his navigation charts, checking his calculations one more time. He wrote a short letter to Doris, just 3 sentences. "Good morning, sweetheart. We have a big day ahead. I love you and Barbara more than anything." He folded the letter, put it in his footlocker, and headed to the flight deck. The dawn was clear and bright. A few scattered clouds hung over the ocean. The carrier's deck crew had already positioned his aircraft, Bureau number 4614, on the port catapult. His radio man and rear gunner, aviation radio man second class, James Francis Murray, was already in the rear cockpit, checking the twin .30 caliber machine guns. Best climbed into the front cockpit. The familiar smell of aviation fuel and hot metal surrounded him. He checked his instruments methodically. Airspeed indicator, altimeter, compass, oil pressure, fuel gauge, radio, oxygen system, bomb release mechanism. Everything worked. Everything was ready. At 0702, Enterprise turned into the wind. The deck officer gave the signal. Best pushed his throttle forward. The right cyclone engine roared. The propeller became a blur. The deck crew pulled the wheel chocks. Best released the brakes. The Dauntless accelerated down the flight deck, picking up speed, and lifted into the air. 36 other dive bombers followed him into the sky. They formed up in sections of 3 climbing to 19,000 feet, heading southwest toward the last known position of the Japanese carrier force. Best commanded Bombing Squadron 6, Section 1. His wingmen were Ensign Frederick Thomas Weber and Ensign Richard Jacquard. Good men, young men. Weber was 22 years old, Jacquard was 23. They had families waiting for them too. They would follow Best wherever he led. The flight to the target area took 2.5 hours. Best's oxygen mask pressed against his face. The temperature at 19,000 feet was below freezing. He could see his breath condensing on the inside of his canopy. Below the Pacific stretched to every horizon an endless expanse of blue, broken only by the occasional whitecap. At 0940, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading the entire group of dive bombers, reached the coordinates where Japanese carriers were supposed to be. Nothing. The ocean was empty. No ships, no wake trails, nothing. McCluskey had a decision to make. Turn back to Enterprise before running out of fuel or keep searching. He kept searching. At 1005, he spotted a Japanese destroyer running at full speed, leaving a long white wake behind it. The Arashi. She had been depth charging an American submarine and was now racing to catch up with the carrier force. McCluskey made a gamble. He followed the destroyer's course. It was a simple calculation. If the destroyer was trying to catch up with the fleet, then following the destroyer would lead to the fleet. It was not fancy tactics. It was common sense. But sometimes common sense is the difference between victory and defeat. 15 minutes later, at 10:20 in the morning, Wade McCluskey and his dive bombers found the most important target of the Pacific War. 4 aircraft carriers. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, all 4 together in a tight formation. The ships that had attacked Pearl Harbor. The ships that had conquered half the Pacific. The ships that Japanese officers believed were invincible. And they were completely vulnerable. Their flight decks were covered with aircraft being refueled and rearmed. Fuel lines lay across the decks like a spider web. Bombs and torpedoes were stacked in the open, waiting to be loaded onto planes. The Japanese had been preparing for a second attack on Midway Island when American carriers were spotted. Then they had rushed to switch from land attack bombs to anti-ship torpedoes. The rearming process had created chaos on the carrier decks. Everything was exposed, everything was flammable, and there was not a single Zero fighter at high altitude to protect them. All the Japanese fighters were down low at wave level, where they had just finished slaughtering American torpedo bombers in one of the most one-sided massacres in naval history. 41 American torpedo planes had attacked earlier that morning. 35 had been shot down. Not a single torpedo had hit its target. The Japanese pilots thought they had won. They thought the Americans were beaten. They were wrong. Wade McCluskey looked down at the 4 carriers and made his next decision. He ordered his entire squadron, 37 dive bombers, to attack the carrier Kaga. Every plane, one target, overwhelming force. Dick Best heard the order over his radio. He looked down. He saw Kaga, but he also saw something else. 800 yards away from Kaga sat Akagi, the flagship. Admiral Nagumo's command ship, the leader of the enemy formation, completely undefended, untouched, waiting. Best made a decision in 3 seconds. He broke formation. Best keyed his radio microphone. His voice was calm, almost casual. Section 1, follow me. We're taking Akagi. Weber and Jacquard hesitated for exactly 1 second. Then they followed. 3 aircraft peeling away from the main formation. 3 pilots choosing to disobey the attack plan. 3 men deciding that hitting the flagship mattered more than following orders. Years later, military historians would call it one of the most important decisions of World War II. Best would call it common sense. He saw a target, he attacked it. That was his job. Best rolled his Dauntless into a dive. 70 degrees, almost vertical. The world tilted. The sky disappeared. The ocean rushed up. His airspeed climbed, 200 knots, 220, 240. The carrier grew larger. He could see the red circle painted on the flight deck, the rising sun symbol, the mark of the enemy. He could see men on the deck now. Some looked up, some kept working. They did not know. They could not know. Death was falling toward them and at terminal velocity, and they had no time to react, no time to run, no time to do anything except die. At 1,800 feet, Dick Best released his bomb. 1,000 pounds of high explosive separated from the aircraft. Gravity took over. The bomb fell. Best pulled back hard on his stick. 4 Gs pressed him into his seat. Blood drained from his head. His vision narrowed to a tunnel. The Dauntless shuddered and groaned, pulling out of the dive, fighting against momentum and gravity and the laws of physics that said an aircraft diving at 260 miles per hour should not be able to change direction so quickly. But the Dauntless held together. Best leveled off at 1,500 feet, banking hard. Wright, already looking for the next target, already thinking about the fuel gauge that showed he might not have enough gas to make it back to Enterprise. Behind him, his bomb struck Akagi near the center elevator. The impact made almost no sound, just a thump, like someone dropping a bag of cement on a wooden floor. But that thump started something unstoppable. The bomb punched through the flight deck. It penetrated through 2 inches of steel plating that was supposed to protect the carrier from exactly this kind of attack. It did not stop. It kept going, down into the hangar deck, down into the space where aircraft were being fueled and armed, down into the most vulnerable part of the ship at the most vulnerable moment. And then it exploded. Before we continue with what happened next, I want to hear from you. If you are a veteran, or if your father or grandfather served in World War II, leave a comment below. Share their story, because men like Dick Best did not fight for monuments or medals. They fought for you, for me, for America. Hit the like button if this story moves you. And stay with me, because what happens next will show you the true cost of victory. The explosion tore through Akagi's hangar deck with the force of a small earthquake. 1,000 pounds of Composition B high explosive detonated in a confined space filled with aviation fuel-armed aircraft and hundreds of men. The blast wave expanded at 7,000 meters per second. Steel bulkheads buckled. Deck plating rippled like water. The concussion killed every man within 30 meters instantly. Their bodies simply ceased to exist, turned to vapor, gone. But the bomb itself was just the beginning. The shock wave ruptured fuel lines that had been hastily strung across the hangar deck during the frantic rearming process. Aviation gasoline, hundreds of gallons of it, sprayed into the air like water from a broken fire hydrant. The fuel atomized into a fine mist, and then it found the flames. The secondary explosion was 3 times larger than the first. A massive fireball rolled through the hangar deck from bow to stern. The temperature jumped from 70 degrees to over 1,800 degrees in less than 2 seconds. Paint on the bulkhead spontaneously combusted before the flames even touched it. Rubber tires on parked aircraft melted and began to burn, creating thick black smoke that filled every compartment. Men who had survived the initial blast now found themselves engulfed in flames so hot that their uniforms ignited before they could run. A Nakajima B-15 Kate bomber fully loaded with a Type 91 aerial torpedo was lifted off its wheels by the blast. The aircraft tumbled across the hangar deck like a child's toy. The torpedo, weighing nearly 2,000 pounds and armed with over 400 pounds of explosives, rolled free from the bomb bay. It bounced once, twice. Then it struck a steel support column. The impact detonator fired. The torpedo exploded with a roar that shook the entire carrier. Men on the bridge 3 decks above were knocked off their feet. The blast tore a hole in the hangar deck 15 feet across. Shrapnel screamed through the confined space, shredding everything in its path. The explosion set off another torpedo mounted on a nearby aircraft. Then another. Then another. The chain reaction had begun. Within 90 seconds of Dick Best releasing his bomb, 12 torpedoes and over 30 bombs had detonated inside Akagi's hangar deck. The entire midsection of the carrier had become a blast furnace. Aluminum aircraft parts melted and ran like mercury. Steel beams glowed cherry red from the heat. The wooden flight deck planking began to char and smoke, and the fires kept spreading. Commander Aoki, Taijiro Akagi's captain, stood on the bridge watching his ship die. He was 51 years old. He had served in the Imperial Japanese Navy for 30 years. He had commanded Akagi for only 4 months. He grabbed a speaking tube that connected to the damage control center. His voice was steady despite what he was seeing. "Report. I need a full damage report immediately." The response came back broken by static and background noise. Explosions, screaming, the roar of flames. "Captain Hangar Deck is completely involved. Fires from frame 40 to frame 120. Temperature exceeding critical limits. Automatic firefighting system destroyed. We are attempting manual suppression, but the heat is too intense. Multiple casualties. Request permission to flood affected compartments." Aoki closed his eyes for 1 second. Flooding the hangar deck meant admitting the ship could not be saved by conventional damage control. It meant giving up. But he also knew that sometimes the only way to save a ship was to sacrifice part of it. "Permission granted. Flood all compartments that can be isolated. Save what you can." Below decks damage control teams were already fighting the impossible battle. Petty Officer Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the air attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, was in the ready room when Best's bomb hit. The explosion threw him against a bulkhead. Both his legs broke. He lay on the deck, unable to move, watching smoke pour through the ventilation system. Other pilots dragged him into the corridor. They carried him up 3 ladders toward the flight deck, their hands slipping on his blood. Behind them, the temperature in the ready room climbed past 200 degrees. Papers on the briefing table burst into flames. Charts curled and blackened. The room that had planned the attack on Pearl Harbor was being consumed by fire. On the hangar deck, Chief Warrant Officer Kyoto led a firefighting team into the inferno. 12 men following him. They wore no protective gear, no breathing apparatus, just their regular uniforms and the desperate courage of sailors trying to save their ship. They dragged fire hoses through smoke so thick they could not see more than 3 feet. The hoses were connected to pumps drawing seawater from below. Kyoto opened the nozzle. Water sprayed onto the nearest fire. The water hit metal that was over 1,200 degrees. It flashed to steam instantly. The steam created a scalding cloud that filled the compartment. Kyoto kept the water flowing. His men advanced step by step into the darkness. Then another torpedo exploded. The shockwave threw all 12 men backward. Kyoto hit a bulkhead and fell. His right arm was broken. His face was burned. He could not hear anything. His eardrums had ruptured from the overpressure. But he stood up. He grabbed the hose again with his left hand. He kept spraying water into the flame. 2 of his men were dead, killed by shrapnel from the explosion. The other 9 stood up and kept fighting. They advanced another 10 feet. The heat was so intense that their uniforms began to smoke. One sailor collapsed from heat exhaustion. The others dragged him back and kept going. This was not cowardice. This was not incompetence. These were brave men fighting for their ship with everything they had. They were doing exactly what Dick Best had done. Their duty, without hesitation, without complaint. War does not care which uniform you wear. It only cares whether you quit or keep going. The Japanese sailors kept going, but the fires kept spreading. At 10:40, 18 minutes after the bomb hit, the anti-aircraft ammunition storage ignited. Thousands of 25mm rounds cooked off in the heat. They exploded like fireworks. Shell fragments pierced through bulkheads, shot upward through the flight deck, ricocheted down corridors. Men trying to fight fires on the flight deck suddenly found themselves under fire from their own ship. 3 sailors died from fragments that came up through the deck, plating beneath their feet. The exploding ammunition created new fires. Those fires found new fuel. The cycle continued. Admiral Nagumo stood on Akagi's bridge watching 3 of his 4 carriers burning. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu. All 3 hit within the span of 5 minutes by American dive bombers. All 3 ablaze. Only Hiryu remained untouched, and she was already launching a counterattack against the American carriers. Nagumo's chief of staff approached. His uniform was torn. His face was streaked with soot. "Admiral, we must transfer your flag to another ship. We cannot command the fleet from here. The smoke is interfering with radio communications. The fires are spreading toward the bridge." Nagumo did not want to leave. To abandon Akagi felt like betraying her, like admitting defeat. But he was not just the captain of one ship. He commanded the entire carrier strike force, or what was left of it. His duty was to the fleet, not to his pride. "Prepare a boat. We will transfer to destroyer Nowaki." At 1100, Admiral Nagumo and his staff climbed down rope ladders into a motor launch. As the boat pulled away from Akagi's hull, Nagumo turned to look back at the carrier. Black smoke poured from the hangar deck openings. Flames shot through gaps in the flight deck. The ship that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, the ship that had seemed invincible, was dying. Tears ran down Nagumo's face. He did not wipe them away. His staff pretended not to notice. The motor launch headed toward Milwaukee. Behind them, Akagi continued to burn. But 5,000 miles to the east, Dick Best knew none of this. He was focused on one thing: getting back to Enterprise. His fuel gauge showed critical. He had maybe 20 minutes of flying time left, maybe less. The Dauntless had not been designed for extended combat operations. It had been designed to fly from a carrier attack a target and return quickly. Best had been in the air for over 3 hours. His tanks were nearly empty. He flew east. The ocean below looked exactly the same in every direction. No landmarks, no navigation aids, just water. If he missed Enterprise, if he flew past the carrier even by a few miles, he would run out of fuel and ditch in the ocean. The chances of being rescued were almost zero. The Pacific was too big. The American fleet was too small. Men who ditched in the ocean usually died of exposure within 48 hours. Best checked his compass, checked his watch, did the math in his head. Enterprise should be 70 miles ahead. At his current airspeed, that was about 18 minutes. His fuel gauge said he had maybe 15 minutes left. He pushed the throttle forward slightly. The engine responded. The fuel gauge needle dropped faster. Best ignored it. He had made his decision. Either he would make it back or he would not. Worrying about it would not change anything. At 11:42, he spotted a gray shape on the horizon. Enterprise. He keyed his radio. Enterprise, this is Best. Inbound for landing. Fuel state critical. The carrier's air controller responded immediately. Roger, Best. You are cleared for immediate landing. Deck is clear. Wind is good. Come straight in. Best lined up on the carrier's stern. He lowered his landing hook, extended his flaps, reduced power. The Dauntless descended. At 100 feet, he could see the landing signal officer on the flight deck giving him the cut signal. Best chopped the throttle. The aircraft dropped. The wheels touched the deck. The tailhook caught the number 3 arresting wire. The Dauntless jerked to a stop in less than 80 feet. Best sat in the cockpit for 5 seconds. His hands were shaking. Not from fear, from adrenaline draining away. From 3 hours of absolute concentration finally releasing. He unbuckled his harness and climbed out. His legs almost gave out when his feet hit the deck. A plane handler grabbed his arm. You okay, sir? Best nodded. He could not speak yet. His throat was raw. He walked toward the island superstructure on legs that felt like rubber. Behind him, the deck crew swarmed his aircraft, refueling, rearming, inspecting for damage. They would have the Dauntless ready to fly again in less than 30 minutes. The ready room was full of pilots. Some had just returned from the strike. Others were preparing to launch. Everyone was talking. The intelligence officer, Lieutenant Commander Brigham Young, saw Best and rushed over. Did you hit them? Did you get the carriers? Best's voice was hoarse. Hit Akagi. Don't know if she sank. Saw fires. Big fires. Why, Young wrote notes frantically. McCluskey got Kaga. Dive bombers from Yorktown got Soryu. 3 carriers hit. That leaves Hiryu. She's still operational, and she just launched a strike against Yorktown. Best felt something cold settle in his stomach. Yorktown was the 3rd American carrier. If Hiryu sank her, the odds would shift back toward Japan. 3 American carriers against 1 Japanese carrier had been acceptable. 2 American carriers against 1 was dangerous. Where is Hiryu now? Young checked a map. Last known position here, about 100 miles northwest. We're preparing a strike. Best looked at the map, looked at his watch. It was 11:45. He had been back on Enterprise for exactly 3 minutes. His aircraft was being refueled right now. He could be in the air again in 20 minutes. Put me on the strike list. Young looked at him carefully. Dick, you just flew a 3-hour mission. You look like hell. Let someone else go. Best shook his head. I know where the carriers are. I know what they look like from altitude. I know the attack pattern. Put me on the strike list. Young hesitated. Then he wrote Best's name on the roster. "You're section leader again. Launch in 30 minutes." Best nodded. He went to the galley and forced himself to drink a cup of coffee and eat a sandwich. His hands were still shaking slightly. He ignored them. In the head, he splashed cold water on his face, looked at himself in the mirror. His eyes were bloodshot. His face was pale. His oxygen mask had left red marks on his cheeks. He went back to the ready room, studied the map, memorized the coordinates. At 15:15, he walked back to the flight deck. His aircraft was ready. Bureau number 4614. The same plane he had flown that morning. The same plane that had hit Akagi. The deck crew had painted a small, rising sun symbol below the cockpit. One kill, one enemy carrier. Best ran his hand over the fresh paint. Then he climbed into the cockpit. At 15:30, he launched for his second combat mission of the day. Most men could not survive one dive bombing attack. Dick Best was about to fly two in the same day, against the best carrier force in the world, with fuel that might not be enough to get him home again, with his body already exhausted from 3 hours of high-altitude flying. But Dick Best did not think about survival. He thought about duty. The strike group found Hiryu at 16:45. She was steaming northwest at high speed trying to escape. But there was nowhere to run, no place to hide. Not from American dive bombers. Not from pilots who had just seen what happened to the other three carriers. Not from men who understood that this was the battle that would determine whether Japan or America controlled the Pacific. Best led his section into the attack. Same dive angle, same airspeed, same precise technique. At 1,700 feet, he released his bomb. Direct hit. The bomb struck Hiryu near the forward elevator. It penetrated to the hangar deck. It exploded among armed and fueled aircraft. The same chain of reaction that had destroyed Akagi now consumed Hiryu. Fires. Secondary explosions. Chaos. Death. Dick Best had just become the only pilot in United States Navy history to sink two enemy aircraft carriers in one day. But the price of that achievement was about to come due. Best's oxygen system had malfunctioned during the second dive. A faulty fitting had allowed caustic soda from the CO2 scrubber to leak into his oxygen supply. He had been breathing in the fumes for over an hour. His lungs were burning. Every breath felt like inhaling broken glass. He coughed. Blood spattered on the inside of his oxygen mask. He flew back to Enterprise in pain, landed at 17:30, climbed out of the cockpit and collapsed on the flight deck. The deck crew caught him before he hit the steel plating. They carried him to sickbay. The ship's doctor examined him, listened to his lungs, saw the blood he was coughing up, made a diagnosis that would change Best's life forever. "Lieutenant, you have tuberculosis, chemically induced from the caustic soda exposure. Your lungs are severely damaged. You need immediate hospitalization. Your flying days are over." Best was 32 years old. He had just fought in the most important naval battle of World War II. He had sunk two enemy aircraft carriers. He had helped turn the tide of the Pacific War, and now his war was over. He spent the next 2 years in naval hospitals. Lost 50 pounds, nearly died 3 times from complications. The tuberculosis scarred his lungs permanently. He would never fly again, never breathe normally again. Every breath for the rest of his life would be a reminder of June 4th, 1942. But when reporters came to interview him years later, when historians asked him about Midway, when people called him a hero, Dick Best always said the same thing: "I did my job, that's all." Every man on Enterprise did his job. Every man on Yorktown and Hornet did their jobs. I just happened to be the one who dropped the bombs on Akagi and Hiryu. Any other pilot would have done the same thing. That was America, right there in those words. Not bragging, not seeking glory, not demanding recognition. Just a man doing his duty. A man who understood that when your country needs you, when your brothers need you, when freedom itself hangs in the balance, you do not ask what it can. You do not calculate the odds. You do not worry about tomorrow. You just do the job. Meanwhile, 5,000 miles away, Akagi was still burning. The damage control teams had fought for 6 hours. They had poured thousands of gallons of seawater onto the fires. They had flooded compartments. They had risked their lives again and again advancing into the inferno, but the fires would not stop. Every time they extinguished one blaze, the heat ignited something new. Aviation fuel that had soaked into the wooden deck planking. hydraulic fluid from burst lines, paint, insulation, electrical wiring. Everything was fuel. At 1600, Captain Aoki convened an emergency meeting with his senior officers. The men who gathered in the bridge were exhausted. Their uniforms were torn and burned. Their faces were black with soot. Some had bandages on their hands and arms. All of them knew what was coming. Aoki spoke quietly. "Gentlemen, I need honest assessments. Can this ship be saved?" Silence. The sound of flames crackling somewhere below. The groan of stressed metal. Finally, Commander Nakajima, the damage control officer, spoke. "Sir, with respect, I do not believe so. The fires have spread to compartments we cannot reach. The hangar deck structure is failing. We have lost all firefighting water pressure in the forward section. Even if we could extinguish the fires now, the damage to the hull is too severe. The ship cannot sail. She cannot launch aircraft. She is finished." Aoki nodded slowly. He had known this was coming, had known it since the first hour, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real, made it final. How many casualties? Over 200 dead or missing, another 100 seriously wounded. Most of the hangar deck crew, many damage control personnel. "Sir, we did everything possible." The men fought bravely. "I know they did." Aoki looked out the bridge window at his burning ship. At the ship he had commanded for only 4 months. At the ship that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor. At the ship that had seemed invincible just that morning. "Prepare to abandon ship. All personnel not essential for keeping her afloat will transfer to the destroyers. I will remain aboard until the end." The evacuation began at 1630. Destroyers Arashi and Nawaki came alongside. Lines were secured. Wounded were transferred first. Stretcher after stretcher lowered carefully into motorboats. Men with burns. Men with broken bones. Men who had breathed too much smoke. The destroyer's medical staff worked frantically to stabilize them. Then the rest of the crew. Group by group, section by section. 800 men climbing down rope ladders into boats. Many were crying. Leaving Akagi felt like betrayal, like abandoning a wounded comrade. But orders were orders. By 1715, most of the crew had been evacuated. Captain Aoki made a final inspection. He walked through the ship, checking every compartment that could still be accessed, making sure no living man was left behind. The heat in some sections was so intense, he could only open the hatch, look inside, and close it again. No one could have survived in those spaces. At 1730, Aoki was the last man to leave Akagi. He stood on the flight deck looking at the damage, the hole where Best's bomb had penetrated, the twisted metal, the charred wood, the smoke still pouring from below. He saluted, then he climbed down into the motorboat. As the boat pulled away, Aoki turned back one last time. Akagi still floated, still burned, listing to starboard but refusing to sink. Stubborn until the end. "Goodbye, Akagi," he whispered. "Forgive me." That night, Akagi drifted alone in the darkness. Fires blazed throughout her hull. Occasionally, an explosion tore through the silence. The ship listed more and more to starboard. But she would not sink. She had been built too well. Her compartments were too well sealed. Even burning, even dying, she refused to go down. Admiral Yamamoto, commanding the Japanese fleet from battleship Yamato 300 miles away, received the reports. Akagi could not be saved. She could not be towed. She could not be left to drift as a hazard to navigation. And she absolutely could not be allowed to fall into American hands. At 0200 on June 5th, Yamamoto sent an encrypted message to the fleet. 4 words: "Scuttle Akagi by torpedoes." On destroyer Arashi, the squadron commander received the order. His hands trembled, holding the paper. Around him, officers stood in silence. Some wept openly. They had to sink their own flagship. They had to kill the ship that had led them to victory after victory. They had to do it with their own weapons. But orders were orders. Duty was duty. At 0500, 4 destroyers formed a line 1,500 meters from Akagi. Torpedo tubes turned toward the carrier. Sailors loaded Type 93 torpedoes, the best torpedoes in the world. Fast, long-range, powerful. They had been designed to sink enemy ships. Now they would sink a friend. The squadron commander gave the order. His voice broke. "Fire!" 4 torpedoes launched. White foam trails streaked across the dark water. Racing at 50 knots, heading toward Akagi. On the destroyers, every man stood at attention. Many raised hands in final salute. Tears flowed freely down weathered faces. The first torpedo struck Akagi's starboard side near the bow. A massive column of water erupted. The ship shuddered. The second torpedo hit amidships, right where Best's bomb had struck 18 hours earlier. The explosion was tremendous. The third and fourth torpedoes hit the stern almost simultaneously. Two explosions that cracked the hull structure. Seawater rushed in through four massive holes. The damage control system had been destroyed hours ago. There was nothing to stop the flooding. Nothing to save her now. At 05:05, Akagi began her final journey. The list increased dramatically. Water flooded the hangar deck, finally extinguishing the fires that had burned for over 18 hours. The bow dipped lower. The stern began to rise. At 05:15, the massive carrier rolled onto her side. For one moment, she seemed to hesitate, as if reluctant to leave the world she had once dominated. Then at 05:20 on June 5, 1942, IJ and Akagi slipped beneath the waves. The bow went first. Then the bridge and island structure. The flight deck, once crowded with aircraft preparing to conquer the Pacific, disappeared under the water. Finally, the stern with its massive propellers rose high into the air. Then slowly, majestically, it slid beneath the surface. Within moments, only ripples remained. A few pieces of debris floated on the oil-slicked water. The Red Dragon was gone, sunk to a depth of 5,400 meters, down into darkness where she would rest undisturbed for 77 years. On the four destroyers, every man stood at attention in absolute silence. They had just witnessed the end of an era, the death of Japanese naval supremacy in the Pacific, the beginning of the end for the empire. One bomb, released by one American pilot, had started the chain of events that led to this moment. Dick Best's bomb, a farm boy from New Jersey, doing his duty, nothing more, nothing less. I want to pause here for a moment, take a breath with me. The greatest generation is almost gone. Over 1,000 World War II veterans die every single day. Soon there will be none left. If you know a veteran, thank them today. If your father served, ask him about his service while you still can. Record his stories, preserve his memory. Share this video with someone who needs to remember what Americans are capable of when freedom is on the line. That is what matters. That is what we must remember. When freedom is threatened, when evil rises, when darkness tries to extinguish the light, ordinary Americans become extraordinary. Not because they seek glory, but because they understand duty, because they love their country, because they refuse to quit. The hospital room at Pearl Harbor Naval Hospital smelled of disinfectant and starched sheets. Dick Best lay in bed, thin and pale, coughing blood into a handkerchief. It was September 1942. 3 months after Midway, 3 months after he had changed the course of the war, 3 months after his lungs had been destroyed by caustic soda fumes. The doctor stood at the foot of the bed reviewing his chart. Commander Stevens, a good man, he had treated hundreds of wounded sailors, but this case was different. This was not a wound from enemy fire. This was a man destroyed by his own equipment, by a faulty oxygen system, by bad luck and worse timing. Stevens spoke gently. Lieutenant, I have your test results. The tuberculosis has progressed. Your lung capacity is down to 40%. The scarring is permanent. You will never fly again. Best had known this was coming, had known it since the first night when he coughed up blood on Enterprise's flight deck. But hearing it spoken as medical fact made it real. Final, his flying career was over at age 32. The thing he had trained for, the thing he was good at, the thing that had given his life purpose. Gone. He looked at the doctor. His voice was calm. How long do I have? Stevens hesitated. With treatment and rest, you could live a relatively normal life, but you need to stay in the hospital for at least 6 months, maybe longer. The tuberculosis needs to be controlled. If you push too hard, if you try to go back to active duty, you will die within a year. Best nodded. When can I see my wife? She is here. She has been here every day for the past week. She is waiting outside. Send her in. Doris Best entered the room. She was 29 years old, pretty, scared. She had left their daughter Barbara with her mother in California and flown to Hawaii as soon as she received the telegram. She sat in the chair beside his bed and took his hand. Her hands were shaking. Bess squeezed her fingers. Hey, sweetheart, sorry about all this. Doris tried to smile. Failed. Tears ran down her face. Dick, what happened? The Navy would not tell me anything except that you were wounded and in the hospital. Were you shot down? Did you crash? No, nothing like that. My oxygen system malfunctioned during a dive. I breathed in some chemicals, damaged my lungs. The doctors say I will be okay, but I cannot fly anymore. Cannot fly anymore. Dick, flying is your career, your life. What will we do? Bess looked at the ceiling. He had been asking himself the same question for 3 months. What do you do when the thing that defines you is taken away? What do you do when your purpose disappears? I do not know yet, but we will figure it out. We always do. Doris leaned forward and kissed his forehead. I am just glad you are alive. When I got the telegram, I thought you were dead. I thought I had lost you. You have not lost me. I am right here and I am not going anywhere. But that was only partly true. Dick Best was right there in that hospital bed. But the man he had been, the dive bomber pilot, the warrior, that man was gone. Killed not by enemy fire, but by a faulty piece of equipment in 8 seconds of bad air. Best spent the next 6 months in the hospital, then another year convalescing at home. He lost 50 pounds. His skin turned pale and waxy. His hands shook. He could not walk more than 100 yards without stopping to catch his breath. The simplest activities exhausted him. Playing catch with his daughter left him gasping. Climbing stairs required rest breaks. The Navy discharged him in June 1944. Medical retirement, full disability. They gave him a pension and a handshake and sent him home. At age 34, Dick Best's military career was over. 20 years earlier than he had planned. 20 years before he was ready. He moved his family to Santa Monica, California. Bought a small house 3 blocks from the beach. Got a job at Douglas Aircraft working as an engineering consultant. The same company that had built the SB Dauntless, the plane that had carried him to glory and ruin. He worked there for the next 28 years. Quiet work, desk work, the kind of work where nobody gets shot at and nobody becomes a hero. He never talked about Midway, not to his co-workers, not to his neighbors, not even much to his family. When people asked what he had done in the war, he said he had been a naval aviator. If they pressed for details, he said he had flown dive bombers in the Pacific. If they asked if he had been in any famous battles, he said yes, he had been at Midway. And then he changed the subject. He did not want glory. He did not want attention. He just wanted to live a quiet life with his wife and daughter. He wanted to go to work, come home, have dinner, read the newspaper, and forget about the war. Forget about the burning carriers. Forget about the men he had killed. Forget about the price he had paid. But you cannot forget something like that. Not really. The memory stayed with him. Every time he climbed stairs and had to stop to breathe. Every time he coughed and tasted blood. Every time he saw an airplane in the sky. The memories were there. June 4th, 1942, 10:22 in the morning, the moment his bomb released, the moment everything changed. Years passed. The world moved on. World War II became history. Korea happened. Vietnam happened. The men who had fought in the Pacific grew old. Their children grew up. Their grandchildren were born. The greatest generation slowly faded into memory, but the debt remained. The debt that America owed to men like Dick Best. The debt that can never be fully repaid. In 1999, Dick Best received a phone call that would change his final years. A Japanese historian named Masataka Chihaya was researching the Battle of Midway. He had interviewed Japanese survivors, read Japanese naval records, pieced together what had happened on June 4th, 1942, and he had discovered something remarkable. He had identified which American pilot had hit Akagi, which bomb had started the fires, which attack had doomed the flagship. Lieutenant Richard Best, Bombing Squadron 6, USS Enterprise. Chihaya wanted to meet Best, wanted to interview him, wanted to hear the story from the American side. He flew to California and spent 3 days talking with the old pilot. Best was 89 years old now, frail, his breathing labored, but his memory was sharp. He remembered every detail, the dive angle, the airspeed, the sight picture, the release point, everything. Chihaya asked the question that had haunted Japanese naval historians for decades. Mr. Best, did you know that your bomb hit Akagi? Did you know what happened after you left? Best shook his head. Not until after the war. All I knew on June 4th was that I hit something and there were fires. I did not know if the ship sank. I did not know if my bomb made any difference. I was just trying to get it back to Enterprise without running out of fuel. Your bomb made all the difference. It started the fires that destroyed Akagi. Without that hit, she might have survived. She might have launched another strike. The battle might have gone differently. Best was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that revealed the heart of the man. I'm sorry for the men who died on Akagi. I know they were just doing their duty like I was doing mine. War is a terrible thing. It makes enemies out of men who might have been friends in different circumstances. Chihaya later wrote that he had expected to meet a warrior, a man proud of his accomplishment, a man who celebrated the destruction of Japan's greatest carrier. Instead, he met a quiet gentleman who spoke with sadness about the necessity of war and respect for his former enemies. That was Dick Best. That was the greatest generation. They did terrible things because those things needed to be done. They killed because killing was necessary to preserve freedom. But they took no joy in it. They felt no pride in the destruction. They understood that war was not glorious. It was simply duty, necessary. Brutal, final. In 2001, Best attended a midway reunion in Hawaii, the 60th anniversary of the battle. Only a handful of pilots who had flown that day were still alive. Best was one of them. They gathered at the USS Arizona Memorial. Old men now, gray hair, wrinkled skin, bodies worn down by age and time. But when they stood together, you could still see the warriors they had been. A reporter asked Best what he remembered most about June 4th, 1942. Best thought for a moment. Then he said, I remember being scared. I remember thinking I might not make it back. I remember seeing the carrier below and knowing that if my bomb did not hit, then all those torpedo pilots who died earlier that morning would have died for nothing. That was what I remember. The weight of responsibility, the knowledge that other men were counting on me to do my job. Do you consider yourself a hero? Best laughed, a short, dry laugh that turned into a cough. No, I was just a pilot doing his job. The real heroes were the torpedo bomber boys. VT-8, VT-6, VT-3. They flew into hell knowing they probably would not come back. They attacked without fighter cover, without surprise, without any advantage. 35 out of 41 were shot down. Those men were heroes. I just had good luck in a broken oxygen system. The reporter pressed. But you sank 2 carriers. No other pilot in history has done that. I dropped 2 bombs that hit 2 carriers. The ships sank because of what happened after the bombs hit. The fires, the explosions, the damage control failures. I just released the bombs. Everything else was luck and circumstances beyond my control. That was Dick Best, deflecting credit, minimizing his role, honoring the men who had not come home. The reporter did not understand. He was looking for a hero who fit the Hollywood image, the warrior who reveled in victory, the ace who bragged about his kills. But Dick Best was not that kind of man. He was a humble servant who had done his duty and paid the price and wanted nothing more than to honor his fallen comrades. Dick Best died on October 28, 2001. He was 91 years old. He passed away quietly at his home in Santa Monica. His wife Doris was with him. His daughter Barbara held his hand. At the end, he said something that his family remembered forever. His last words, I did my best. 4 words, simple, honest, true. He had done his best for his country, for his shipmates, for freedom. He had given everything he had, his health, his career, his future, and he had never asked for anything in return except the knowledge that he had done his duty. The Navy buried him with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. A 21-gun salute. Taps played over his grave. The flag folded and presented to his family. Representatives from the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force attended. They laid a wreath at his grave. They bowed. They honored the man who had sunk their Navy's flagship. Because war does not last forever. Enemies become allies. Hatred fades, but honor remains. Duty remains. Sacrifice remains. And the men who embody those values deserve respect regardless of which uniform they wore. On October 20th, 2019, 77 years after the Battle of Midway, research vessel Patrol discovered the wreck of Akagi. The carrier lay upside down on the ocean floor at a depth of 18,000 feet, 3.5 miles below the surface, in darkness so complete that no sunlight had reached her since the day she sank. The research team used sonar and remotely operated vehicles to map the wreck, to see what remained of the ship that had seemed invincible. The damage was catastrophic. The flight deck had collapsed. The hull was broken in several places. Debris was scattered across hundreds of yards of ocean floor, but the ship was still recognizable, still identifiable as Akagi, the Red Dragon, resting in her final position, a steel tomb for the 267 men who had gone down with her. The discovery made international news. Historians and veterans from both Japan and America commented. They spoke about the battle, about the turning point, about how June 4th, 1942 had changed the Pacific War and possibly changed the outcome of World War II itself. But Dick Best was not there to see it. He had been dead for 18 years. He never knew that Akagi had been found, never knew that the ship he had bombed, the ship that had haunted his memories for decades, was still down there in the darkness, still bearing the scars of his attack, still marked by the hole his bomb had punched through her flight deck. But maybe it is better that way. Maybe Dick Best would not have wanted to see the wreck. Maybe he would have preferred to remember Akagi the way she had been on June 4th, 1942. A powerful warship, a worthy opponent, a ship filled with brave men doing their duty just as he had been doing his. Because that is what war is. Not good versus evil, not heroes versus villains, but duty versus duty. Men on both sides fighting for what they believe is right, killing and dying and sacrificing because that is what their countries ask of them. Dick Best understood that. He killed hundreds of Japanese sailors on June 4th, 1942. His bombs started fires that burned men alive. That caused explosions that tore bodies apart. That created hell on earth inside Akagi's hangar deck. He knew that. He lived with that knowledge for 59 years. And it weighed on him, not with pride, not with satisfaction, but with the terrible understanding that war requires terrible things from ordinary men. Yet he did not regret his actions, because those actions were necessary, because those bombs helped stop Japan's conquest of the Pacific, because those deaths, as horrible as they were, prevented even more deaths. Because sometimes doing the right thing requires doing the hard thing, the painful thing, the thing that will haunt your dreams for the rest of your life. That is what duty means. Not doing what makes you feel good, not doing what brings glory, but doing what needs to be done regardless of the cost. The men of the greatest generation understood that. Your grandfather understood that. Your father understood that if he served in Korea or Vietnam, they did not fight because they loved war. They fought because their country needed them, because freedom was threatened, because evil had to be stopped. And they paid for it. Some paid with their lives, some paid with their bodies, some paid with their minds. Dick Best paid with his lungs, his health, his flying career, and decades of pain. But they all paid, every single one, because freedom is not free. It costs. It always costs. And someone has to pay the bill. We are living on the dividends of that payment right now. The freedom we enjoy, the prosperity we have, the peace we experience, all of it was bought with the blood and sacrifice of men like Dick Best. Men who did their duty without complaint. Men who gave everything and asked for nothing. Men who saved the world and then came home and went back to work and raised families and never bragged about what they had done. That is the America Dick Best fought for. Not the America of headlines and glory. Not the America of movies and medals. But the America of ordinary people doing extraordinary things because it is the right thing to do. The America where duty matters more than comfort. Where courage means doing your job even when you are terrified. Where sacrifice is expected, not celebrated. That America still exists. It exists in every veteran who served. It exists in every first responder who runs toward danger. It exists in every parent who works 2 jobs to provide for their family. It exists in every person who understands that some things are worth fighting for, worth dying for, worth sacrificing for. Freedom is one of those things. America is one of those things. The values that Dick Best embodied, duty, honor, sacrifice, those are worth preserving, worth defending, worth passing down to the next generation. But we are losing that, slowly, quietly. The greatest generation is almost gone now. The men who stormed the beaches, who flew the bombers, who sailed the ships. They are dying, 1,000 every day. Soon they will all be gone. And with them will go the living memory of what they did, what they sacrificed, what they stood for. That is why stories like Dick Best's matter. That is why we must remember. Not to glorify war, not to celebrate killing, but to honor the men who did what needed to be done when the world needed it done. To remember that freedom has a price. That duty is not optional. That ordinary Americans are capable of extraordinary things when called upon. If you are watching this and you are a veteran, thank you. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your sacrifice. Thank you for doing your duty when your country needed you. You are part of a tradition that stretches back to Valley Forge and Bunker Hill. A tradition of citizen soldiers who answer the call, who do the job, who pay the price. If you are the son or daughter of a veteran, honor your father's service. Ask him about it if he is still alive. Write down his stories, preserve his memory, because men like your father are why we live in freedom today. They are why we sleep safely at night. They are why America is still the greatest nation on earth. And if you are young, if you are wondering whether duty and honor still matter in the modern world, look at Dick Best's life. Look at what one man did on one morning in June 1942. Look at how his actions changed history. Look at the price he paid and the grace with which he paid it. Then ask yourself what you are willing to sacrifice for something bigger than yourself. Because that is the question every generation must answer. What are you willing to fight for? What are you willing to die for? What are you willing to sacrifice to preserve freedom for your children and grandchildren? The greatest generation answered that question with their lives. They fought. They bled. They died. They won. And then they came home and built the greatest civilization in human history without asking for parades or monuments or eternal gratitude. All they asked was that we remember, that we honor their sacrifice by preserving what they fought for, that we pass down the values they embodied to the next generation, that we never forget the price of freedom. After his first mission, Best could have said no to flying again that day. He could have claimed exhaustion, too shaken, too worried about fuel. No one would have blamed him. He had already done more than most men do in an entire war. But that is not what Americans do. That is not what the greatest generation did. They went, they fought, they sacrificed, and they never asked for anything in return except the knowledge that they had done their duty. That is the America worth fighting for. That is the America worth preserving. That is the America that Dick Best believed in. An America where ordinary men become extraordinary, not because they seek glory, but because they understand duty, where sacrifice is given freely, where courage means doing your job even when you are terrified, where freedom is defended by citizen soldiers who answer the call and pay the price and never ask for anything in return. That America still exists, in every heart that understands duty, in every soul that values freedom, in every person who is willing to sacrifice for something bigger than themselves. Do not let it die. Do not let the memory of men like Dick Best fade into history. Tell their stories, honor their sacrifice, live by their example, because the world still needs men and women who understand that duty is not optional, that courage is not comfortable, that freedom costs, and that some things are worth any sacrifice. Dick Best understood that. He lived it. He proved it. On June 4th, 1942, and every day after until October 28th, 2001, he did his best for America, for freedom, for us. Now it is our turn to do ours. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, share it. If you are a veteran or the family of a veteran, leave a comment below. Tell us your story, because these stories matter. These memories matter. These men and women matter. And as long as we remember, as long as we honor, as long as we preserve what they fought for, they will never truly die. God bless Dick Best. God bless the greatest generation. And God bless America.